In the quietest corner of the old music academy, a girl named Alara was a secret that everyone knew. She wasn't famous like the teachers who gave big concerts. She wasn't loud like the other students who laughed in the hallways. Alara was a shadow, a whisper made of music. When she played the piano, it was like she was just a pair of hands, separate from the rest of her. Her fingers would dance across the black and white keys, never making a mistake. They could play the hardest songs written by the old masters, songs that made other students sweat and panic. For Alara, it was as easy as breathing. She would sit on the hard wooden bench, her back perfectly straight, her eyes looking at the sheet music but not really seeing it. She was just a machine, playing the notes that were written on the page. The sounds that came out of the piano were beautiful, perfect even, but they were empty. They were like beautiful, empty shells you find on the beach. Nice to look at, but with no life inside. Her teachers would watch her, nodding their heads. Technically perfect, they would say to each other. Her control is amazing for someone her age. They were proud of her in a way. She was their star student, the one who proved their teaching methods worked. But they also felt a little sad, a little disappointed. They would listen for something more, for a spark of feeling, for a piece of Alara's own heart in the music. But they never found it. The music was always clean, always correct, and always cold. Alara knew what they thought. She could see it in their eyes when they watched her play. She could feel it in the polite, quiet clapping after she finished a song for them in a small classroom. They were clapping for a robot, not a person, and deep down, it made her feel like she was disappearing. The piano was supposed to be her voice, but it felt like a cage. Every day she would go to the practice rooms, which were small, stuffy boxes with soundproof walls. She would close the door, and the world would go away, leaving only her and the big black piano. She would open her book of music, and the dots and lines on the page would stare back at her like 1,000 tiny eyes. She would play, and the notes would fill the small room, bouncing off the walls. But they weren't her notes. They were someone else's feelings, someone else's story, written down 100 years ago. She was just a messenger, delivering a letter she couldn't read. She felt a deep loneliness that she couldn't explain. It was a heavy feeling in her chest, a weight that got heavier every time she played a song perfectly. The other students didn't understand. They saw her talent and wished they had it. "You're so lucky, Alara," one girl once told her. "You make it look so easy." But Alara didn't feel lucky. She felt like a ghost. She would walk through the halls of the academy, hearing the other students playing their instruments. She could hear the mistakes, the struggling notes, but she could also hear something else. She could hear their fight, their passion. A boy down the hall would play the same wrong note on his violin over and over again, each time with a little more frustration, a little more anger. A girl in the next room would sing a high note and crack, then laugh at herself and try again. They were all putting a piece of themselves into their music. Their music was messy and imperfect, but it was alive. Alara's music was perfect, and it was dead. She would sometimes go to the big concert hall when no one was there. She would sit in one of the red velvet seats in the very back row and look at the empty stage. The grand piano sat there under a single spotlight, looking like a sleeping giant. She would imagine playing on that stage, not for a test or for a teacher, but for a real audience. She would imagine them leaning forward in their seats, not just hearing the notes, but feeling them. She would imagine them crying or smiling because of the story her music was telling. But then the image would fade and she would see herself again. The girl with the perfect hands and the empty heart, playing a song that wasn't hers. The dream felt impossible. One afternoon, her main teacher, a stern woman with sharp eyes, asked her to stay after her lesson. "Alara," the teacher said, her voice soft but serious, "you have a gift. A very rare gift. Your fingers are magic." Alara just looked down at her hands, folded in her lap. But the teacher continued, "Music is not just about fingers. It's about the soul. You have the technique, but you are holding back. You are afraid to let the music touch you." Alara felt a lump in her throat. She wanted to tell her teacher that she wasn't afraid. She wanted to tell her that she was trying, that she didn't know how. But the words wouldn't come out. How could she explain a feeling she didn't understand herself? How could she explain that every time she tried to put her own feelings into the music, they just vanished, leaving only the cold, correct notes behind. That night, Ilara went back to her small room at the boarding house attached to the academy. She didn't turn on the light. She just sat on her bed in the dark, looking out the window at the city lights. The lights twinkled like 1,000 tiny, distant stars. Each one, she thought, was a person with a story, with feelings, with a life. And she was just a shadow watching from a distance. She felt a single, hot tear run down her cheek. She wasn't sad, not exactly. It was a feeling deeper than sadness. It was a feeling of being lost. The piano was her whole world, but it was a world she had built for herself, and now she was a prisoner in it. She was the best at playing the piano, but she was the worst at being a musician. And she didn't know how to break free. She lay back on her bed, the tear drying on her skin, and listened to the silence. It was a heavy silence, full of all the music she had inside her that she could not let out. The days that followed her teacher's quiet warning felt different for Ilara. It was as if a tiny crack had appeared in the perfect glass wall she had built around herself. Before, she had just been a student doing her job. Now, she was a student with a problem she didn't know how to solve. The weight of her teacher's words, "You are holding back," sat on her shoulders like a heavy coat. She went to her lessons. She did her practice. She played the notes perfectly, but her mind was somewhere else. It was searching, digging through her thoughts for a key, a switch, something that would unlock the part of her that was missing. The biggest event of the year for the academy was approaching. It was the grand fundraiser. A night when all the wealthy people who supported the school would come to listen, eat fancy food, and give money. The main hallways, usually filled with the sounds of struggling instruments, were now filled with the sounds of cleaning and decorating. Workers polished the floors until they shone like mirrors and hung fancy drapes from the ceilings. There was a buzz of excitement in the air, but for Ilara, it just felt like more pressure. During a morning assembly, the headmaster, a man with a big, booming voice and an even bigger smile, stood on the stage to make an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice echoing in the large room, "the grand fundraiser is just 1 week away. This is our chance to show our generous patrons the wonderful talent we are nurturing here." He went on for a while, talking about the importance of the event and how everyone should be on their best behavior. Then, he came to the part he was most excited about. "This year, we are honored to have a world-famous pianist as our guest performer." The room erupted in applause. Ilara didn't clap. She just stared at the stage, feeling a familiar sense of distance. A world-famous pianist. Someone who played with fire, with soul. Someone who was everything she was not. The headmaster held up his hands to quiet the room. "But," he said, "even a star performer needs a break. During the cocktail hour, before the main show, we would like to have one of our own students provide some background music. Something light, something pleasant, to create a wonderful atmosphere." He looked out over the sea of students, his eyes scanning the crowd. Ilara knew what was coming. She felt a small, cold knot form in her stomach. "We need someone who is reliable, someone who is polished, someone who can represent the very best of this academy," the headmaster continued. A few of the teachers in the front row started whispering and nodding. Ilara saw her own teacher lean over and say something to the headmaster. The headmaster's face lit up. "Of course. What a splendid idea," he boomed. "We have the perfect student for this. A young woman whose technique is flawless. A true gem of our conservatory. Ilara, my dear, would you do us the honor?" Every head in the room turned to look at her. 100 pairs of eyes landed on her at once. She felt her face get hot. She wanted to disappear into her chair. This was not the honor they thought it was. It was a test, but it was the wrong kind of test. They weren't asking her to show her soul. They were asking her to be a beautiful musical piece of furniture, to be pleasant, to be quiet. She stood up slowly, her legs feeling shaky. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The headmaster beamed. "Wonderful. Just something simple and elegant, my dear. A little Debussy, perhaps. Something to set a nice, calm tone." After the assembly, a few students came up to her to congratulate her. "Wow, Ilara, that's amazing." One of them said, The headmaster picked you?" But their words just felt hollow. They were congratulating her for being the best at being boring. Later that day, her teacher found her in the practice room. "This is a great opportunity for you," the teacher said, her tone serious. "To play for such an important audience. You must be prepared." She handed Alara a book of sheet music. "I have selected a few pieces. They are simple, but beautiful. They will show off your control and your delicate touch." Alara took the book. The pages were filled with the familiar dots and lines. She looked at the title of the first piece. It was called Clair de Lune, which means moonlight. It was a famous, gentle, and very calm piece of music. It was exactly what they wanted. It was everything she was fighting against. "Thank you," Alara said, her voice flat. Her teacher looked at her for a long moment, her sharp eyes seeming to look right through her. "Alara," she said softly, "sometimes the quietest music can be the loudest, if you play it with your heart." Then she turned and left the room, leaving Alara alone with the piano and the book of pleasant tunes. Alara sat down on the bench. She opened the book to Clair de Lune. She placed her fingers on the keys, ready to begin her practice. She started to play the first few notes. They were soft and gentle, just like the music asked. They were perfect. But as the melody flowed from the piano, something inside her snapped. It was a tiny, almost silent snap, like a single thread breaking. But it was enough. She stopped playing. The silence in the room felt loud. She looked at her hands resting on the keys. They were the hands that could play anything. They were the hands that everyone admired. But they weren't hers. They were tools. And she was tired of being a tool. A feeling started to rise up from deep inside her chest. It wasn't a clear thought. It was hot and messy. It was the frustration of 1,000 hours of practice that led to nothing. It was the loneliness of being the best and the most alone. It was the anger of being asked to be quiet one more time. She looked at the sheet music sitting on the stand. The neat, orderly notes seemed to be mocking her. They were a cage, and she had just been handed the key to lock herself inside it for a whole night. In a sudden, sharp movement, she reached out and slammed the book shut. The sound echoed in the small, soundproof room. It was the first real, unplanned sound she had ever made in that room, and it felt good. A small, dangerous spark of defiance flickered to life inside her. They wanted a simple tune. They wanted something pleasant. They wanted her to be a shadow. But for the first time in her life, Alara didn't want to be a shadow. She didn't know what she was going to do yet. The spark was just a tiny flicker, but it was there. And in the darkness of her quiet, perfect world, a tiny flicker was all it took to start a fire. For the next 2 nights, Alara lived a double life. During the day, she was the same quiet, obedient student. She went to her classes. She nodded at her teachers. And she even sat with the book of Debussy music on the piano in her practice room. She would play the first few bars of Clair de Lune, her fingers light and gentle, just as she was supposed to. But her heart wasn't in it. It was a performance, an act to keep anyone from guessing what was truly going on inside her. The moment the academy fell silent and the last teacher had gone home, a different Alara would emerge. She would wait until the hallways were dark and empty, her footsteps the only sound on the polished floors. She wasn't going to her small, stuffy practice room. She was heading for the main concert hall, the place where the famous guest pianist would soon be playing. It was forbidden for students to be in there after hours, but that only made the idea more thrilling. The heavy velvet curtains at the entrance were drawn shut. Alara would slip through a small gap in the side, her heart beating a little faster with the thrill of breaking a rule. Inside the hall was a giant sleeping shadow. The hundreds of red velvet seats were empty, waiting for an audience that wasn't there. The air was cool and still, smelling of old wood and dust. And on the stage, under a single, lonely ghost light, sat the grand piano. It looked huge and powerful, like a sleeping beast. This was the piano that mattered, not the small practice pianos. This one was meant for big music, for real music. On the first night, she just sat on the stage for a long time, looking out at the empty seats. She felt very small, but also very free. There was no one here to judge her, no one to expect her to be perfect. She walked over to the piano and slowly lifted the lid. The inside was a beautiful landscape of strings and hammers, all waiting for a command. She sat down on the bench, the cool leather smooth against her legs. She didn't have any sheet music. She didn't need it. She placed her fingers on the keys, just like she had 1,000 times before. But this time, she wasn't thinking about Debussy. She wasn't thinking about any composer. She was thinking about the feeling she had when the headmaster asked her to play something simple. She was thinking about the heavy coat of her teacher's expectations. She was thinking about the loneliness of being a ghost in her own life. And then she began to play. It wasn't a song. At least, not a song anyone had ever written before. It was a noise, a low, angry growl from the deep bass notes of the piano. It was the sound of the frustration she had kept bottled up for years. Her hands, which had always been so gentle and precise, came down on the keys with a force that surprised her. The sound that came out was not beautiful. It was raw. It was messy. It was loud. It was the sound of her own voice, finally breaking free. She didn't care if it was wrong. She didn't care if it wasn't pleasant. For the first time, the music was coming from her, not from a page. Her fingers began to move faster, finding a rhythm that was jagged and uneven. It was like a fight, a struggle. The high notes were like sharp, desperate cries, while the low notes rumbled like a storm in the distance. She was pouring all of her feelings into the piano. The sadness, the anger, the frustration, the deep, deep loneliness. It was all there in the crashing chords and the haunting melodies that seemed to appear out of nowhere. She wasn't thinking about what she was playing. She was just feeling it. Her eyes were closed, her body swaying with the music. She was no longer a technician playing notes. She was a storm, and the piano was her thunder. On the second night, she went back. The feeling of freedom was even stronger. This time, she wasn't just angry. She was exploring. She started with the same low, rumbling notes, but then she let them soften into something else. It was a quiet, questioning melody, like a person lost in the dark, searching for a way out. The music was telling a story now. Her story. It was the story of the girl who was trapped, who was told to be quiet, who was afraid to be seen. Then the music began to build again. It grew stronger, more confident. The rhythm became more powerful, like a heartbeat that was getting faster and stronger. It was the sound of her finding her own power. It was the sound of her deciding that she didn't want to be a shadow anymore. She played for over an hour, lost in a world of her own creation. The music had its own life now. It had moments of intense anger, followed by moments of deep sadness, and then flashes of bright, defiant hope. It was a roller coaster of sound, and she was holding on for the ride. When she finally stopped, her hands were shaking, and her forehead was damp with sweat. The last note she played hung in the air of the empty hall, vibrating slowly until it faded into silence. The silence that followed was different from the silence she was used to. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a full silence, a silence that was still buzzing with the energy of the music she had just made. She sat there, breathing heavily, her hands still resting on the keys. She felt exhausted, but also more alive than she had ever felt in her entire life. She had created something. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't polished. It wasn't what anyone would expect from her. But it was real. It was a masterpiece of her own making, a fiery, messy, beautiful masterpiece, born from the quiet, lonely parts of her soul. She knew she couldn't play the Debussy. She just couldn't. It would feel like a lie. As she walked back to her room in the dark, the secret music was still playing in her head. She had no idea what was going to happen at the fundraiser. She had no idea if she would even have the courage to play what she had created. But for the first time, she had something that was truly hers. And that tiny, dangerous spark of defiance inside her was no longer just a flicker. It was a flame, and it was ready to burn. It was ready to burn. The night of the grand fundraiser arrived with a strange electric feeling in the air. The academy, usually a place of quiet focus and solitary practice, was transformed. The main lobby was filled with people dressed in their finest clothes. The women wore sparkling dresses and the men wore sharp suits. The The sound of their chatter and laughter was a constant, polite hum, like a machine made of happy noises. Elara stood near the entrance, feeling completely out of place. She wore a simple, dark dress that felt plain and dull next to all the bright colors and fancy fabrics. She was like a single, quiet note in a loud, chaotic song. She watched as the guests sipped their glasses of champagne and talked about important things. They were the people who paid for the academy to exist, the people her teachers wanted to impress. And tonight, she was supposed to be one of the pretty things on display. A piece of living art meant to be pleasant and not distracting. The headmaster moved through the crowd like a friendly ship, shaking hands and smiling his big, booming smile. Every now and then, he would look over at Elara and give her a reassuring nod. But his smile didn't make her feel better. It just reminded her of the role she was supposed to play. Her teacher found her a few minutes before she was supposed to go on. "Are you ready, my dear?" she asked, her eyes scanning Elara's face. "Just remember, play from the heart, but gently. We want to create a calm and elegant atmosphere." Lara just nodded. She couldn't bring herself to speak. She felt like a fraud. Her heart was beating so fast, she thought it might jump out of her chest. The secret music she had created was playing in her head, a wild, stormy melody that was the complete opposite of calm and elegant. She felt a war going on inside her. One part of her, the part that had been trained for years, was screaming at her to play the Debussy. To be good, to be obedient, to not cause a scene. But another part of her, the new part that had been born in the dark, empty concert hall, was telling her to be brave. "To be real, it's time," the headmaster's voice announced, cutting through her thoughts. He was standing on a small stage at one end of the lobby. He tapped a microphone, and the polite hum of the crowd quieted down. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us this evening," he began. "As we prepare for our main performance in the concert hall, we are delighted to have some beautiful music from one of our most talented students. Please welcome to the stage the wonderful Elara Vance." A small, polite round of applause followed. Elara's legs felt like lead as she walked towards the small stage where a polished black piano was waiting. There was a single spotlight on her, and she felt like a bug under a microscope. Every eye in the room was on her. She could feel their expectations, their desire for something nice and simple. She sat down on the bench, her back perfectly straight, just as she had been taught. She placed her fingers on the keys, her hands trembling slightly. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside her. She looked out at the crowd. She saw their smiling, expectant faces. She saw her teacher in the front row, giving her a small, encouraging nod. She saw the headmaster, beaming with pride. For a split second, she thought about playing the Debussy. It would be so easy. It would be safe. She could just play the notes, make them happy, and then disappear. But then she saw the sheet music for Claire de Lune sitting on the stand. The neat, orderly notes seemed to be laughing at her. They were a symbol of everything she was fighting against. And in that moment, the war inside her was over. She knew what she had to do. She began to play. She started with the soft, gentle opening arpeggio of the Debussy piece. The notes floated out into the room like a soft cloud. The crowd nodded in approval. A few people even closed their eyes, a look of peaceful enjoyment on their faces. Her teacher smiled. This was it. This was what they wanted. This was the pleasant, calm tune. Elara played for about 10 seconds, letting the simple, beautiful melody fill the room. Then, without warning, she stopped. The silence that followed was sudden and sharp. A few people opened their eyes, a confused look on their faces. And then, her hands came down on the keys like a clap of thunder. The gentle cloud of Debussy was shattered, replaced by a raw, powerful, and angry sound. The music that came out of the piano was not calm. It was not elegant. It was a storm. It was the music she had created in the dark, the music of her soul. The polite hum of the crowd was gone. The room fell into a stunned, wide-eyed silence. People stopped talking. They stopped sipping their drinks. They just stared. Her fingers flew across the keys, playing a melody that was full of struggle and pain. The music was chaotic and unpredictable. It had moments of intense crashing power followed by moments of quiet, haunting sadness. It was the sound of a person breaking free. It was the sound of a heart that had been silent for too long, finally learning to scream. She saw the headmaster's smile disappear. His face went pale, and his mouth fell open in shock. She saw her teacher's encouraging nod turn into a look of horror and disbelief. But she didn't stop. She closed her eyes and poured everything she had into the piano. She played for the lonely little girl who practiced in a stuffy room. She played for the frustrated teenager who felt like a ghost. She played for the young woman who was tired of being told to be quiet. The music was her story, and she was telling it with every fiber of her being. The people in the crowd were frozen. Some looked angry, some looked confused, but most of them just looked mesmerized. They had come expecting a simple tune, a background noise for their party, but they were getting something else entirely. They were getting a glimpse into a raw, real, and powerful human soul. When the last thundering chord faded into a vibrating echo, Ilara's hands were shaking, and she was breathing heavily. She opened her eyes and looked out at the crowd. The room was completely silent. Not a single person was clapping. Not a single person was moving. They just stared at her, their faces a mixture of shock and awe. For a moment, Ilara felt a wave of panic. She had done it. She had ruined everything. She had disobeyed everyone. She had made a scene. She had failed. She sat there on the bench, waiting for the anger, for the boos, for the headmaster to come and drag her off the stage. But it didn't come. Instead, after what felt like an eternity, a single person in the very back of the room started to clap. It was slow at first. Then it got faster and louder. It was a catalyst. One by one, other people started to join in. Soon, the entire room erupted in an explosion of applause. Far louder and more passionate than anything a simple tune could have ever received. They were on their feet, their faces filled with a raw excitement that matched the energy of her music. Ilara stood up, her face flushed, not with embarrassment, but with a profound sense of release. She had done it. She had been brave. She had been real. And in that moment, as the applause washed over her, she knew that she was no longer a ghost. She was finally, truly alive. The sound of the applause was like a physical thing, a wave of warmth that washed over Ilara and pushed away the last of her fear. It wasn't just clapping. It was a roar, a living, breathing force that filled the room and vibrated through the floorboards, up the legs of the piano, and into her very bones. For so long, she had heard polite, quiet clapping. It was the sound of approval, the sound of well done. But this was different. This was the sound of feeling, the sound of people who had been touched, shaken, and awakened. She stood on the small stage, her body trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer force of the moment. The faces in the crowd were no longer just polite and smiling. They were alive. Some had tears in their eyes. Others were looking at each other with expressions of pure shock and wonder. They had come for a nice, quiet evening, and they had been given a storm, and they loved it. Through the sea of faces, she saw the headmaster. His face was a canvas of confusion. His mouth was slightly open, and his eyes were wide. He looked like a man who had expected to see a small, tame house cat, and had instead come face to face with a magnificent roaring lion. He didn't know whether to be angry or amazed. Then her eyes found her teacher, a woman who had always told her to have more soul, who had encouraged her to play from the heart, staring at her with an expression that was even more complicated than the headmaster's. There was still a flicker of horror there, the shock of the unexpected. But underneath it, something else was growing. It was a dawning light of understanding, a slow realization that the student she thought she knew was a completely different person. The applause started to die down, and the reality of what she had done began to sink in. She had defied them all. She had ignored the instructions, broken the rules, and risked everything. A quiet voice of panic started to whisper in her mind again. What happens now? What will they do to me? Before she could get lost in that fear, a man in a sharp tuxedo, who had been standing near the stage, walked up to her. He was the guest performer, the world-famous pianist she had only seen in pictures. He was older, with silver hair at his temples and kind, intelligent eyes. He didn't look angry. He looked fascinated. "That was not Debussy," he said, his voice quiet but clear, so only she could hear. Alara shook her head, unable to speak. He looked at her, really looked at her, not as a student or a performer, but as a person. "They asked you for a tune," he continued, a small smile playing on his lips. "You gave them a war. You gave them a soul." He reached out and gently touched her shoulder. "Thank you." Then he turned and walked away, leaving Alara standing there, her mind reeling. A few moments later, the headmaster finally made his way to the stage. The polite smile was back on his face, but it looked a little stiff, a little forced. He took the microphone. "Well," he said, his voice trying to be cheerful. "That was certainly unexpected. A very passionate performance from our young Alara. Let's all make our way into the main concert hall for the main event." His words were a clear signal. The show was over. Her part was done. As the guests began to move towards the concert hall, Alara felt a wave of loneliness wash over her. The adrenaline was fading, and the cold fear was starting to creep back in. She slowly packed up her sheet music, leaving the book of Debussy on the piano. She didn't need it anymore. She was about to slip away, to disappear before anyone could talk to her, when she felt a hand on her arm. It was her teacher. "Alara," she said, her voice soft. "We need to talk." Alara's heart sank. This was it. The lecture, the punishment, the end of her time at the academy. She followed her teacher down a quiet hallway and into her small, private office. The room was filled with books and sheet music, and it smelled of old paper and tea. Her teacher motioned for her to sit down in a comfortable chair. She didn't sit at her big desk, but in the chair next to Alara, which made the conversation feel less like a scolding and more like a talk between two people. For a long moment, she just looked at Alara, her sharp eyes studying her face. "What you did tonight was reckless," she finally said. "It was disobedient. It was the complete opposite of what I asked you to do." Lara looked down at her hands, folded in her lap. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "No," her teacher said, her voice surprisingly gentle. "Don't be sorry. I was shocked. I was horrified for a moment, but I was also wrong." Alara looked up, surprised. "All these years I have been trying to teach you how to put feeling into the music," her teacher continued. "I told you to play from the heart, but I think I was wrong about what that meant. I wanted you to put feeling into the old music, to play their notes with passion, but what you did tonight, you didn't play their music. You played yours, and that was the most real, the most powerful music I have ever heard." A single tear rolled down her teacher's cheek. "You have a fire inside you, Alara. A fire I always hoped was there, but I never knew how to find. Tonight you didn't just play a song, you showed us who you are." Lara felt a lump form in her throat. All the loneliness, all the frustration, all the years of feeling like she wasn't good enough came rushing to the surface. But this time, it wasn't a painful feeling. It was a feeling of release. "I don't know if I can play the old music anymore," Alara said, her voice shaking. "Then don't," her teacher said simply. "Or at least, not yet. The most important thing is to never let that fire go out. You are a composer, Alara, not just a performer. You have stories to tell." The next few weeks were a blur of change. The story of the fiery performance at the fundraiser spread through the community. Some people thought it was a scandal, a sign of a rebellious student. But most people, especially the other students, saw it as an act of bravery. They looked at her differently now, not as the quiet, perfect robot, but as someone with a powerful voice. The headmaster, after a long and awkward conversation, decided not to punish her. The fundraiser had actually raised more money than ever before. People were talking about the academy, and they were talking about the amazing, passionate student who had played with such raw emotion. It was a strange kind of fame, but it was hers. Elar's lessons changed. Her teacher stopped giving her pieces to perfect. Instead, they would just talk. They would talk about feelings, about stories, about life. Then her teacher would say, "Show me." And Alara would sit at the piano and play. She would play her anger, her joy, her sadness, her hope. The music was still messy and chaotic sometimes, but it was always real. She started to write down her own compositions, not with neat, perfect notes, but with scribbles and drawings that only she could understand. She was no longer a prisoner in a cage of black and white keys. The piano was no longer her cage. It was her world, a world that she was building herself, one fiery, beautiful note at a time. She was still Alara, the quiet girl from the academy. But she wasn't a ghost anymore. She was a musician. She was an artist. She was just getting started.